Well, welcome to the podcast. My name is Jeff, and I'll be your host. And today our topic is Magdala, the crossroads of Jewish and Christian history. And our guest today, never been on the podcast before, but has been on our television show, Father Eamon Kelly. And Father Kelly is the vice director at Magdala and the former vice charge of the Pontifical Institute Notre of Jerusalem. He lives in Magdala by the Sea of Galilee in Israel and is featured on season 8, episode 5 of our television show, First Century Foundations, which you can pick up and view on our YouTube channel. Father Kelly, it's great to have you on the podcast today. Welcome.
Thanks. It's good to see you as well, Jeff. It almost feels like you're here in Magdala.
Well, you know what? I wish I was there in Magdala. I got close back in November, but then Omicron hit and we actually ended up cutting our trip short. We never made it up to Galilee, but I intend to be back there as soon as I possibly can. I remember visiting you there one morning and we sat out on your little porch while you had your breakfast and looked out over the Sea of Galilee. It is a beautiful, beautiful setting.
Yes, and you can come back because actually I just had a family from Toronto here right now. And they're of Brazilian origin with their teenage kid. And they got in. I said, how'd you get in? Well, it happened to be that they were in Jordan. And as soon as the border opened in Israel on, I think it was Sunday or Monday, then they came, they were over right away. They were kind of expecting this kind of development, so they were set and they took great advantage of it.
Oh, very good. Very good. Well, it's wonderful to reconnect. And I know that since I've been there at Magdala, there's been a lot of changes. The last time we were there, you toured us through part of the new hotel and showed us the dining room where you're sitting right now. And I know now that that's all, that's all been opened up and dedicated and up and running. It's just a beautiful place. And I guess we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. But
when were you here last?
What's
Jeff?
it like? Sorry.
When were you here last?
November 2019.
Oh, lovely. Okay.
Now that's when I was in Magdala. I was
Right.
in Israel this past November,
Right.
but just briefly. So, yeah. Anyway, I want to ask you some questions. People who are listening, people who are watching, maybe have never been to where you are, and we want to kind of let them know a little bit about this site where you make your home and where many tourists now go to visit. What is it like to live in the town where Mary Magdalene lived?
Well, it was probably the ideal place for lockdowns. Actually, I felt a little, not guilty, but a lot of compassion for all the families during the severe lockdowns, when families were expected not to leave their apartments into corridors and only under necessity, having little children on the 8th or 9th or 10th floor of high-rise buildings. And I was here between Mount Arbel and the Sea of Galilee in this oasis of nature, such fertile land in the area, in this oasis of history and archaeology. And with these beautiful buildings, with so much new art expressing the mysteries of our faith. And I just felt it was just a gift that, you can't plan or make, it's just given. It's a gift like all great gifts. So that's, what am I going to say? It's, if you want me to put it in the context of my experience generally in the Holy Land, I came here 15 years ago. And I kind of summarized it with 3 different experiences. The human experience of meeting everybody from around the world, because you really do. And then the experience of everywhere you walk, you're touching history. Mm-hmm. You're touching biblical history. You're touching also human history in the sense of the great movements across this region in one of the major laboratories of civilization. And then you're, as a priest to be here, as a minister of the gospel to be here, sometimes in the Western world, people are, let's say, they kind of have an invisible plastic shield, or I'm not sure if it's plastic, but they have a barrier that doesn't allow too much entrance for gospel message, for spiritual activity, for priestly work. And I've done a lot of work in Central Europe, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and other neighboring countries there. The most notoriously difficult would be the Czech Republic area in terms of secularization. Then also in the United States and the Northeast coast, it's a bit different than in the Midwest. And people have easily put the religious to the side and keep it out. But living here, people come, let's even the most secular Jewish people come into the site, and it's amazing the conversations that ensue from encounters. There's so much here that provokes an opening of the heart, an opening of the mind. And so I found this to be, it's like if you're a doctor and you go to help people and nobody wants to come. And there's lots of sick people around, but nobody wants to talk about it. And there's some type of blockages, mental, emotional, psychological, historical prejudices. But then the doctor goes, let's say, to some place where there's real need, and he can just do 1,000 of these operations in a couple of days with a little triage help. That's what I feel here, is that the circumstances are really conducive to being what we are and offering the ministry we can offer here. And I think you have that experience as a pastor, bringing people here, the amount of opening that develops in the hearts and minds and souls of people, their readiness to engage in the dynamics that are happening through grace, through God's word, through the experience of the geography and history and sociology of biblical overtones and undertones and all kinds of tones. It's very helpful to be living here. It's wonderful, humanly speaking, spiritually for me, and it's my ministry.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's some great insight. And let's dive a little deeper on that whole connection between sort of the geography, the history, the spirituality. Why is Magdala considered to be the crossroads of Jewish and Christian history?
Okay. I personally tend to leave out the definite article. And I would just say Magdala, crossroads of Jewish and Christian history. Maybe it's just a tone of modesty in the statement, not pushing it too hard, but because in a certain sense the entire region is a major crossroads historically, or the Temple Mount is, or other places like that. Magdala is blessed with an archaeology which speaks to the Jewish mind and heart. You know, if we have the most beautiful synagogue from antiquity, from the Roman period, from the time of Jesus, from biblical times, on our property, with the oldest menorah ever discovered, and many other features. The Magdala Stone now is actually very highly ranked. We got reconfirmation of this about 6 to 8 weeks ago. The very top leadership of the Israeli Antiquities Authority were here, and they made it very clear to us that their estimation of the Magdala Stone is like one of the top discoveries ever made in Israeli archaeology, and especially related to the Second Temple. You know, I mean, they don't bat an eyelid putting it on the level of the Dead Sea Scrolls from certain aspects. Obviously, the Dead Sea Scrolls is an incredibly unique discovery. So all of these things, and we have the ritual baths, which are of extraordinary quality. And to see that the impact this has, the resonance this heart has in the minds and hearts of the typical Jewish visitor, or other people who know culture, maybe they're not Jewish, and they might even be atheists, but they know the culture that's involved, so they're very deeply impressed. And then when we realize that our synagogue, did you hear what I said? Our synagogue? Like, when did you hear a Catholic priest saying our synagogue? I'm asking that to your podcast hearers, to listeners. When did you ever hear a Catholic priest saying our synagogue?
True,
you know?
Very true.
So then that's already an expression of this crossroads. So it's also very meaningful for us because it's the first time we have a synagogue, excavated, physical, tangible, that exists since around the time of Jesus, probably preceding his life, And then going on to about the year 67, that's the archaeological presumption conclusion about the site. So a century spanning over before and after Jesus. Then that's where we started. We started in the synagogues of Galilee and Judea. Jesus was visiting the synagogues. The same thing Paul did. When Paul went around the northeast of the Mediterranean, let's say Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, present-day countries, Greece, Italy, Cyprus, Malta, in this tract, the first place he almost always invariably visited in any location was the synagogue, because that's where Jewish people met. So Jesus is doing the same thing. If you were just to analyze him sociologically, you'd say he's an itinerant rabbi meeting communities at their place of gathering called synagogues. So this is the first one that matches that concept, that encounter location. And so Christians can say, wow, Jesus could have been here. It's on his path. It's a town of fishermen. His disciples are fishermen. They're crossing the lake over and back all the time. The Gospels, even if they don't give you north, south, east, west, even if they don't give you the exact locations, but the idea that he's crossing here, and there's such traffic to Magdala because it's exporting fish to the Roman Empire. So it's like a mecca for the fishermen, for the fishing industry in the Galilee. So the probability, and you have the Mary Magdalene connection, so you have the probability of this being a synagogue where Jesus actually visited, taught, probably healed sick people. His message of salvation was communicated, and we also get goosebumps. I have a little funny line about that I say to the Jewish people when I'm explaining the site. I did that today. I said, have you got goosebumps yet? Just after seeing the oldest menorah, you're just after seeing the most beautiful synagogue from that period. And then I say, well, when I'm traveling, people ask me, what do I do in Israel? And I say that I'm the manager of a goosebumps competition. So I have to see who gets the bigger goosebumps, the Christians or the Jewish people at the synagogue, because we all get goosebumps at the synagogue, And now we get more goosebumps because we have two synagogues.
Yeah, exactly.
We just had this discovery across the road.
Yeah, we do want to chat about that in just a minute. Now, right. Matthew 4:23 says that Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. And you've already referenced this, the probability factor. Can we be certain that Jesus visited Magdala? What's your opinion?
Well, people ask me that very often, or I ask them who, tell me the names of anybody that was in the synagogue, and when they say Jesus, and most of the Israelis do, and I say I always reply to that. I say, well, I can't say that for sure because we lost all the videos.
Very true. Very true.
But I don't feel compelled to push that. I think I let people. There's some people presenting the synagogue. I see that all the time. I even see Israeli guides doing it because they want that impact on their visitors that Jesus was really here, this authentic site. And I appreciate all that language and everything, but I tend personally to be an understatement. I prefer to say, the probability is very high. I do go so far as to say that it's easier to state he was here than to state he was not here. Mm-hmm. Because if you have to prove that he was not here, it's an uphill struggle and you're pulling a big boulder with you. Because pathways go by here for Jesus' travels. It's a fish processing town. The disciples are fishermen. They know this place since they were children, since they were, little kids, 6, 7-year-olds. They came with their grandpa, their uncle, their dad here with their fishing boat, with their boat full of fish. They probably got some lollipops or, pistachio ice cream or whatever kids like, And they're probably texting their friends in Magdala all while they're out there in the public life, traveling through the Holy Land, They're texting their friends in Magdala and saying how it's going, And did your grandmother that Jesus healed? Is she still okay? They're connected. This is their life. This is so that Jesus was here. It's, I think, very easy to buy into. To resist that he was here would be hard to prove. Would be hard to establish. Obviously, one thing that's missing for Magdala in a way are the explicit biblical references about visits here. And there are two exceptions to this. First of all, the person of Mary Magdalene. It doesn't mean there's a visit, but the fact that she's associated with this place. Many people say this is the place of her birth, but I question that. Jesus is of Jesus of Nazareth, but he wasn't born there. But that she would have had a substantial portion of her life here is a very strong probability. And then the fact that we have that verse, forgive me for the quotation at this second, right now it's not coming to me, but you have two names in the New Testament codices with variations. You have Dalmanuta and you have Magadan. And if we go back to the Semitic languages, lack of use of vowels and just emphasis on consonants, then the full name for Magdala in Hebrew is Migdal Nun. Migdal Nun. Dalmanuta.
Okay.
So scholars see a language corruption, which happens all the time. Like we have the place Tabcha for the seven wells. Hepta Pegon becomes Tabcha. So the possibility over centuries of names getting a little bit chewed up, if you will, because of the way people talk. That's the development of language and the normal development of language. And then the other name, Magadan, Migdal Nun. So you have all the consonants that are involved. They roll just a little tad differently. Now, that cannot be established as a total proof, but there are other reasonings for the exegetes. I have a colleague here who's a very good exegete, and he has me see through correlations of the text and the ancient variants in the codices that the probability is very high that it is Magdala, but I don't want to claim that. I think it's hard, and I'm not a scholar of these things. And I think the people don't need that. I think the people want to be, this synagogue is for sure from the time of Jesus. It's the kind of place where he would have taught. This is a very important town. This is Mary Magdalene's town. Did he ever come to this town? It's kind of hard to exclude that he was not here. The fisherman's town. You know, I'm repeating myself now.
No, that's fantastic. And so, you know, you've referenced the fact that this was a fishing town. That was the main source of income in this village. We have the beautiful floor of the port there, underneath the building that you've built. Mm-hmm. Duke and Altum. That's it. I was trying to remember the name as I was talking. Right. And so there's just so much that references the time of Jesus, the fact that it's a fishing village. Now, tell us about the first synagogue that was discovered there in Magdala. That you already said this dates to the time of Jesus.
Right. So one of the fascinating things about our synagogue, again, our synagogue, is that it's the most ornate synagogue. Let's do the physical structure first. It has 3 rows of seating, one inside the outer wall, and 2 sets of seating in a square formation in the center of the space, with a very wide corridor between the outer seating and those 2 rows of seating. So you can seat a couple of hundred people there, probably 150 people in there, maybe 200 squeezing them in. Who knows how expensive were their bodies at that time, you know. But they probably could squat on the floor as well. They wouldn't have a problem if there's a big preacher in like Jesus. If he's doing miracles, they all want to have a place. There was no room to get into the house, Peter's house, so people weren't embarrassed about crowding in on top of each other and letting people down through the roof. So you have a synagogue then that's decorated with mosaics and frescoes, like you find in Pompeii. In fact, there's a little book here by Mike Moss. He's a Jewish fellow who volunteered at our site. He lives half-time here, half-time in England. And he wrote this little book called Magdala, the Pompeii of Israel. He himself might say it's a little exaggerated, but the artistic level is like Pompeii. So who built Pompeii? The richest Romans. And so our synagogue is also providing that little bit of sociological window into the affluence of the community, or at least, let's say if they're a hardworking community, their desire to have high artistic, decorative level in their synagogue, and they also have the willingness to put the money together, if they don't have it in one person's deep pocket, to provide for that. And the fact that the town is processing fish and exporting it means there's cash flow.
Mm-hmm.
And then that means that there's income. Everybody has something to eat. Probably there are deeper pockets that some people have, as in every industry and every export industry. So it's in a certain sense, it's a commercial environment. It's also in the context of the Via Maris that's connecting Alexandria to Damascus, coming through Caesarea Maritima. So our synagogue speaks to an affluent community. It reflects an affluent community, or let's say, if they're not affluent, they're very thrifty, hardworking, and they have certain levels of ability to do things that are way beyond survival levels. And that's an interesting feature to discover from our synagogue, as also from the ritual baths. They really indicate a higher echelon of society. And that's not irrelevant also for our gospel story, because, you know, when I was a child and hearing the gospel stories, and I'm a farming boy from the west of Ireland, we didn't have electricity in our area. When I was a child, we didn't have running water. We had a thatched house, and we didn't ever feel poor. My uncle was in the Philippines as a missionary, 2 aunts in Africa, 2 sisters, 2 nuns, and my uncle a priest, and they were looking after very poor people. And so we felt very well off. And also even relatively in the area, had a large farm. My mother was also teaching and had an income from teaching. So we didn't feel poor. But, you know, when you heard the gospel stories, poor farmers and poor fishermen, and you can't match that with the kind of synagogue we see here. So there's a correction to the popular opinion about the kind of society in which Jesus lived. It wasn't undifferentiated poor. There were obviously poor people like there are in every community, in every society, but there were also very wealthy people. So it's let's say our synagogue points to the fact that Magdala had at least, if it didn't have a completely affluent society, it had a very diversified society with different levels. And the ritual baths also indicate probably a connection to serious priestly families from Jerusalem. That type of culture, the way the baths are built. So we're talking about a community that's very high level, culturally, religiously, and probably also financially. And that's something we glean from the synagogue, just from a sociological, historical perspective, without going into the issues of faith.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, in the middle of this synagogue, when it was discovered, there was something very very obvious, and it still sits there, still remains there. Talk to us a little bit about the Magdala Stone. What does it tell us about the people of Magdala in the time of Jesus?
Okay, so maybe we just say 2 words first. What is the stone? The stone is like a coffee table size, just to give an approximation for people to understand. It's a stone that's sitting in the middle of the floor, and it's ornate. It has sculpted imagery on the stone. The most recognizable image on the stone is that of the menorah, the 7-branched candelabra with the stem that develops into a tripod at the bottom. It also has the altar of incense from the temple, according to the leading expert, Rina Talga. She's publishing the book on that. And the golden altar, the altar of incense, it has 2 jars, 2 pillars. Boaz and Yachim are 2 major pillars in the temple, representing the identity, the great parameters, God, the founder of reality of the cosmos, Boaz, the founder of the house of David, the worship in Jerusalem, and the people of God under the Davidic dynasty in worship before the Almighty. Then you have on the 2 sides, you have colonnades, 2 rows, arches behind arches. You have oil lamps or incense burners, depending on the theory and the archaeologist interpreting. On the top, you have showbread represented. The showbread table had a great significance that we probably haven't developed a lot in our own awareness in Christian communities, and we can probably recover that more. It's a very interesting theme. Then it has this rosette on the top, which the leading interpretation is it's a decoration on the parochet, on the veil before the Holy of Holies. There are other interpretations also. And then you have the opposite end from the menorah, you have 2 arches with 2 wheels inside and flames of fire. So this will be an insinuation of the chariot of fire, which then is actually deeply connected with the Shekinah, the divine presence. We read in Ezekiel how the burning wheels, which is a feature of the charge of fire, are leaving the temple at the time of the exile, heading to Babylon. God is going with his people. He is Emmanuel. He never leaves his people. So we have, that would be the presence of God, which basically in the temple would mean the Holy of Holies. And so the Magdala Stone incorporates all of the major elements of the temple. If you were to take out all these elements we listed from the temple, you basically have nothing left. So then what does this Magdala Stone mean? It's still an enigma, I think. You will find certain people who will give definitive, infallible statements about its purpose, its use, its meaning. Materially, it's a piece of stone from Mount Arbel, which is very interesting because it means it happened here locally. Right here, a couple of hundred yards from here, the stone was taken into the synagogue, sculpted. It's representing the Jerusalem temple within the synagogue in Magdala. It's a first century Jewish community, has this in their synagogue, so they're very Jerusalem connected, very temple connected. I think we're just like staying with very general statements to this point on it. If you want to push further, the question of what was it used for, Rina Tal Gam, there have been different speculations about this. One archaeologist initially did a drawing with 4 legs standing on top of the stone with a table by great imagination, saying that this was a stand to hold the Torah for reading, maybe. Rina Tal Gam thinks that maybe the rolls were just left there on the stone without this extra superstructure that Mati Aviam suggested. In any case, it's very probably related to the study of the Torah. But there's a lot there that still needs to be, I think probably over the next 20, 40, 50 years will be debated and probably polemically fought over until greater clarity is established about its meaning, its significance. But it's very clearly a heavyweight marker that the synagogue had a tremendous spiritual import already before the destruction of the temple. And that's a very important argument academically vis-a-vis the theories that synagogues didn't have great spiritual relevance until after the temple was destroyed. And it's possible that synagogues even had great spiritual relevance even in Babylon, because they no longer had a temple in Babylon, so they were getting together to study the Word of God. And we have the prayers of the Psalms saying, my offering, my sacrifice is the prayer of my lips, the words of my mouth. That's the sacrifice I offered. So the word sacrifice was blood sacrifice, but now it's used in the Psalms as a spiritual sacrifice from the lips and the heart. And we also have the prophet saying, what do I need your bloody sacrifice for if your heart is not with me? So then the possibility of the synagogue being a place of true interior worship is not incompatible, although it's not fashionable in academic circles to talk in that way about the synagogues. But there's movement happening in that area also at the moment. Yeah.
Well, at the very least, it's just an incredibly fascinating piece. And we had the privilege, you made it possible for us to have a replica of the Magdala Stone here in Canada. We toured it around to a few churches and a couple of events and talked about the significance of the stone. And we were very grateful for that, the chance to be able to do something like that here in Canada. It was an incredible privilege.
You should label that because that's probably the first time it ever happened in Canada.
Yeah, no, I think it was. I don't think it had ever been in Canada before.
Exactly.
And so we were thrilled to be able to do that. Now, since I've been there, just recently, you've discovered a second synagogue in Magdala. When does this one date to? Is it different? Is it similar to the first one? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Lovely. Also, just a little comment, the way we use language, all of us who are helping visitors and tourists and pilgrims enjoy the Holy Land and speaking about it on the media, and we say we discovered, we're very generous in the use of the we. And it's not just the royal we of Her Highness. It's because it's a treasure for all of us, so we all kind of share in it. I often have people come here and they say, well, we discovered this synagogue. I say, well, you weren't even here when we discovered it. But we use the we generously, okay?
Yes.
So I didn't discover, okay, I did lift one shovel at lake because I was going over there all the time. Arfan Najjar did the first investigation of the site archaeologically in July, and he was our main leader here. Well, Dina Avshalom Gurney was the main archaeologist, but Arfan was the one leading the concrete work. So we had a great relationship. So I was over on the site of the dig all the time in the summertime, the provisional dig. And then they found some little pieces with plaster, and that's what kicked off then the big dig that happened in November and December. And that dig was so fruitful. The reason for the dig was simply because our intersection here is very accident prone. It's a T-junction. And they want to insert a traffic circle and create two major lanes that absorbs the southern traffic on the 90 going westbound, so it doesn't even enter the circle, and create another similar lane for the westbound traffic going south to Tiberias, so that they stay out of the intersection and reduce the tension there. And in the process of doing that, then they were obviously approaching new land that wasn't constructed before, so they tested for archaeology. That's why it happened. And then the results of this big excavation that happened now, a salvage excavation that happened in November, December, end of October as well, about 8 weeks of excavation, was an entire neighborhood, very elongated because it's matching the need for a road construction. And one of the first big, let's say, aha experiences is that it pushes the boundaries of Magdala right under the foot of Mount Arbel. And there's still a lot of topsoil over that site back into the mountain that hasn't been excavated. And that's obviously washed off Arbel with millennia of flooding and rain and storms and so forth, and animals walking, because there's cows out here all the time. They're always pushing the clay downhill and they're walking on it because they're so heavy. And so you have all that natural erosion of the topside of the mountain hitting down into this lower spot. And then obviously right now it's not fully excavated to the very foot of the mountain where it was built and developed in the first century, and probably later into the time of Bar Kokhba, who knows. But this whole area then is a whole subdivision, if you will, a section of Magdala that has, construction-wise, a lower quality in general than the area around the synagogue or the ritual baths that we have, and even of the other areas we've excavated here. So then the synagogue itself is found about 160 meters away from our synagogue. I'm looking at it right now across here, and I don't think I should move around the computer because of our connections and all the rest of that, but we can use some other footage. Actually, if people want to see it, they could check out my Facebook and YouTube reports, and also Instagram, which is shorter, on the 13th and 14th of December. And you provide those links for them, Jeff, so they can see footage that I did. I did one from up above on Mount Arbel, looking down to see the relationship between the two sites. And then I did one, the Facebook, which is also on YouTube. The Facebook probably has the better quality images. We have Dina Avshalom Gurney. She was leading the dig, and she was also the leader here. She was leading the archaeological side of the dig. Somebody else was the leader of the technical side. And she explains about the value of the discovery of the synagogue. So then what do we have? We have a synagogue about the same size as our synagogue, and I do not know the exact measurements to compare, but there's not a major difference in size. Another feature that's very similar is that we have one row of seats around the periphery, like we have in our synagogue. What we don't have in the second synagogue, the recent one, is the two rows of seating in the center. So it's just one flat level space with the row of seating around the perimeter. But that row of seating also constitutes about probably a meter wide corridor around the center, just like we have, let's say, where the mosaic is in our synagogue. That's a wide corridor around the two sets of seating in the center. And you have a similar type of format in this new synagogue. You have this wide, and that's all built with ashlars, with cut basalt stone. So it's a very substantial structure. It's not poor quality. Then the seating is plastered on top and on the side, and we don't have the plaster on our seating in the first synagogue. So that has, let's say, a better feature in the second synagogue. I don't know if you remember, Jeff, that on the southwest corner of our synagogue, there's a little room attached with a special mosaic floor and a special design on that mosaic.
Yes.
Which we copied later in the baptistry, in the baptismal font in the women's atrium in Ducan Altum. And that space is typically interpreted as a place to hold the scrolls. And as such, then it has great importance, extraordinary importance, and it's on the southwest corner. Well, guess what? In the new synagogue, there's a room similarly on the southwest corner. I'm not sure the measurements again, but it's not maybe twice the size, but it's 1.5 the size of our room. Doesn't have mosaics like ours does, but it's completely plastered, and it has a very high bench around the perimeter, which we don't have because our room is very small in that regard. And that bench is also completely plastered with a white plaster. So that's a very significant feature, and it begins to establish a model where you have a synagogue with a room on the southwest corner, because both of them are in the same structure.
Right.
There's another very interesting feature. And this is just skipping over the synagogue for a second to another detail. Maybe you remember on our site that we have this on the western side, we have a very strong wide road, which is blocked by like a roadblock of columns. And that's a military type of arrangement, and it looks like that they grabbed the columns from the synagogue under emergency pressure of attack by the Romans. That's kind of the general theory. And these columns have plaster and had fresco, which is worn off by now. And that was set up to block a street. Well, guess what? On this long strip on the other side of the road that they excavated for the building of this new lane, there's a road all the way through it, as straight as a line. And in the middle of it, we have a dividing wall blocking it, which is totally ridiculous, totally senseless. If you want to have a road, it's for communication. Why would you block it off in the middle? Completely blocked off, thoroughly blocked off. It's like built across. You can't go through. And it's exactly on the same line as ours.
Wow.
And that recalls Flavius Josephus ben Mattiahu saying, we fortified the northern wall against the Romans. And he would be sitting down in the Franciscan part of the site, which is south of us, which is the ancient part of the site with much deeper levels of archaeology from Hellenic to Ottoman period. And there we have a Greek gymnasium, the famous classical gymnasium, sports and study. And we have water installations, and we have very interesting two docks. The Hasmonean dock and the Byzantine dock with stones for mooring the boats still in place in those docks.
Wow.
So that's where Flavius Josephus would be, a couple of 100 yards south of us. So he says he strengthened the northern wall. So that means then what we have found both in our site and in the new excavation, we could have found what he referred to in his writings as part of their defense against the Roman pending assault. And
amazing.
Another conclusion is that the site of Magdala itself in ancient times is much bigger than we thought. It would also seem then that there's a diversified strata of society, because if you have this area that's not as well built, it's much more improvised, it's a lower budget type of area. That's also interesting, but they were careful to make a very beautiful synagogue in their lower budget economy area. They didn't put in the mosaics and the frescoes, but they made a very strong structure. They invested in it.
Now, Father Kelly, you're talking about the second synagogue, and what I would like to just confirm with you is that that this synagogue actually dates to the same time period as our synagogue. Is this a first century synagogue?
You know, archaeology, when you find something, there are statements made. And then some scholars point out other things and other statements are made. And then other scholars go at it from another angle, and there's a correction process going on about how many levels are in an area, how much, the extent of occupation and so on. And that's based on findings. And then they do more thorough studies, they do publications. Other scholars chime in. And so there's a refining of the statements made about the places. And that happens in all sciences.
Of course.
And so what I really got clear in my head after the conversation, especially with Dina on the new dig, is that the date also of our synagogue goes prior to 0. And so you're talking about early Roman period. And the Pompey, the major Roman general, comes through here in, I think it is in the 60s before Jesus.
Okay.
So Jesus basically comes through here almost a century after Pompey. And then the Roman period, that first early Roman period, is considered up to probably the destruction of the temple, even after that up to Bar Kokhba. As still the Romans. The big change comes with the Byzantine period.
Right.
300s onwards, 330 onwards. So the early Roman period then dates really from the beginning of Pompeii. They probably didn't too much construction-wise for a decade or two. Who knows what they did in the first couple of centuries, but they're getting stronger and more established.
Right.
The Herodians are really working with the Romans. So the Herodian period, Herod the Great, is 40 BC onwards, and so it's a very establishment culture of Roman power that's in the area. So that's conditioning the commerce, it's conditioning the currency, it's conditioning the culture, the interactions. It's still very Greek, affected by all the local culture since the conquest of Alexander the Great. So these are the cultures of the area. That's why Jesus also, when he's crucified, is in Greek and Latin and Hebrew, the title on the cross. So our synagogue's date, I would say, definitely before Jesus' life, through Jesus' life until the Jewish revolt, and they're fried by the time of the destruction of the temple. So they're done before that. So then we're talking, you could go back even, let's say, 50 years before Christ, or 40 years before Christ, 30 years before Christ. Herod was active in this area. He took out his last enemies here at Mount Arbel,
right,
internally, for him to just consolidate his own power. So that means his reach is here, and that's why we have these probably ritual baths here as well. And this high-level culture it could be connected to the top echelons of society at the time. And we know that the Sadducees were very connected to the Roman power and to Herod's power. So they may have huge animosities internally, but they're also one force together for the consolidation of their dominion in the area. Yeah. So, and our synagogues are in that period. They're in early Roman period, so they have a harder time nailing it down to the year. But
right.
I would say it's spanning. It's spanning a good 100 years, and let's say up to 67, so maybe 30 BC or something, that whole period.
Yeah. Well, here's the question I want to get to. So suffice it to say that the two synagogues coexisted during a time period. What does it say about the community at Magdala that they actually had two synagogues?
I would like to confirm that statement you made first, then, because I'm just taking what I have. It's an oral understanding from Dina. It's not published yet. It's too early to have a publication. And so I would say that, except for newspaper reports, so I would say it's definitely both synagogues. I would take this as a fact, accepting what Dina said to me and the other archaeologists, Yehuda Gotrin, who was directing the whole dig, that this is a site. There are parallel contemporary synagogues 160 meters apart in one location. This is unheard of. This is going to surely lead to a major academic debate about the purpose and meaning of synagogue in that period, and maybe also, in a certain sense, burst open cliche understandings. There will be a new investigation academically, new theories. Maybe there'll be more archaeological discoveries down the road, and so this opens up a whole can of worms, if you will, or a whole series of opportunities for new scholarship and understanding. We had before theories that there were no synagogues before temple destruction. We had pretty solid theory that synagogues were not in a religious sense. They were for studying the Torah. They were for society at a town hall. And there was you feel a type of resistance to the thought that there was prayer there. Like, how can you read a psalm without being praying? So I think there are some issues with that type of understanding, and I would imagine now with the fact that there are two synagogues, you're going to have and have to find a rationale for that. And you can't just invent a rationale. You have to discover what was in the minds of the people. And that's going to take looking at the sources again, rereading them in the light of this fact.
Right.
It's no longer a theory if there were synagogues at that time.
Those are some of the nuances that I wanted to get to. And I think that's just so intriguing that this discussion will be sort of ongoing. And we realize that this discovery 160 meters away is so new that there will be much yet to be published about this. And so really appreciate you sharing a little bit of this with us today. And I want to talk just a second about tourism before we're finished.
Right.
I know that tourism is something that's kind of gone the way of the dodo bird in Israel the last 2 years. We have a worldwide pandemic. However, we have great hope that this will be coming back in the next little while. Why is it important for people watching, people listening? Why is it important for Christians to come to Israel and to experience places like Magdala?
I would say it's already becoming cliche to hear statements like the fifth gospel. So, if you discovered that there's a book somewhere in some lost cellar that's talking about your great-grandfather and you don't have any interest in reading it, I wonder if that's realistic. I think most people would want to read this stuff that was written about their family at a certain point in your life. You want to read about it. But this is not just my great-grandfather. This is Jesus.
Yeah.
This is the Bible. This is our faith. And if this is called the fifth gospel, well, it's very important that we read the four gospels we have and assimilate their message, and that's a lifelong task. But the enrichment of perspective and understanding that comes through a physical visit here, and even watch somebody taking a piece of bread, pita, and breaking bread. Hey, 1 second, breaking bread. And dipping it in a plate. And you see all the families here. You go across the road to Tannery, a bunch of Arab families in there having lunch together, Christians from the area, Muslims, and they're breaking bread. And then they have a common plate of hummus in the middle of the table. And you don't take the hummus you're going to eat onto your plate, and you take it, and your sister onto her plate, and your mom onto her plate. No, everybody dips the pita into their plate of hummus, the same plate of hummus or tahina. And I always do that little exercise with the first meal with visitors to say, he who dips in the plate will betray me. He who dips with me in the plate. And you begin to understand things that would be bad manners. My mother would say to me, take your hand out of your brother's plate. Don't put your hand in your sister's plate. The things that children learn in the Western etiquette. Yeah. And here it's a different etiquette. And also just seeing the way women are in society here and the way they dress and the Moors, and it's clear worldwide in the Muslim community, because we're familiar with that, but the Jewish community is the same way. It's the women, they walk separately. You see them, especially in the religious communities. And then it's very easy to imagine the difficulties 2,000 years ago, the challenges, because we live in a different world in the Western world today. So it's not just going to places, put your feet into the water of the Sea of Galilee, and you actually get wet. Or you climb up Mount Tabor or Mount of Olives and you actually go out of breath. It's a tough climb, and you realize these are real mountains. It's not just a painting.
Exactly.
It becomes, you see the archaeology, so many things that speak to the history, that speak to the tangibility. And I think this is very important also theologically, because God became flesh. We just celebrated Christmas. The Word became flesh. Yeah. And we tend in the Western world today, we've become very abstract, and there's a touching, a tangibility. Jesus shook hands today in the gospel we're reading today. It's beginning of Mark's gospel, and Jesus is in there in Peter's house, and he grasps the mother-in-law by the hand. And she's in fever. You don't grasp a person with fever by the hand. You don't want to get contaminated, especially nowadays. And he did that, and she stood up. He lifted her up, and she went on to serve. You're in the place where that happened at Peter's house in Capernaum. Yeah. It's the tangibility, the visibility, almost the smellability, if you can say that. The whiffs of the place. the sunrise in the morning, the colors. By the way, they can see sunrises every morning on my Facebook, YouTube.
Yes, yes.
To see that happening at the Sea of Galilee on Instagram, it's you just have to do that. It's great. It's a real boost. And most people say that their spiritual life has changed. It's a watershed moment.
Yeah.
It was before and after. My prayer life runs differently, and I discovered that over time. It's not something that might happen overnight, but it initiates a process that continues to develop. And like good wine, the longer it's maturing, the more powerful it is. The experience, the richer the experience is.
Yeah. Beautiful insights. And you heard it here, folks. If you are a believer in Jesus, you need to go. You need to experience this place, not just Magdala, but all of Israel. We talk about first century foundations. Well, these are the foundations of our faith, and this is the context where that faith was distilled, where Jesus launched the kingdom of God. And so we just encourage you to think about the time when you will be able to go, time when you'll be able to tour the land of Israel, experience these experiences. If you come with us, I promise you, we will go to Magdala and meet Father Kelly, and it'll be a great experience. So, Father Kelly.
Jeff?
Yes, go ahead.
Jeff, you said your entree on the last statement was, if you're a believer in Jesus. Now, can I give you an opening of this invitation and say, if you're an atheist, if you're a person of culture, if you're a person with an inquisitive mind who wants to explore, and your neighbors or maybe relatives or friends or some of your family were Christian or are Christian, if you want to understand them where they are in their beliefs, and you might consider them, maybe that's not your belief, but that's okay. Come also.
Yes. Come
to see. This is also a fact of culture, of opening the mind and heart, of encountering the other.
Yeah.
Of encountering the other and being enriched. We can all enrich each other.
Very well put. So I will sort of retract and say the word especially if you are a believer in Jesus. But absolutely, everyone should come. And the guarantee remains the same. If you come with us, we'll take you to meet Father Kelly, and we'll have a great time there at Magdala, visiting Ducan Altum and all the. We didn't get to talk about a lot of the details, but so great to be able to converse with you today and to hear your insights. Father Kelly, thank you for being with us on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me and sharing this time and your great interest in the Holy Land. I'm really impressed, Jeff. Thank you so much. You're a leader in the field. And
your website, if people want to visit the Magdala website, how do they go there?
Very simple. The word Magdala, the vowel is always A, magdala.org.
Perfect. All right. Well, we'll make sure we get that up on the screen as well. God bless you, Father Kelly, and I hope to see you soon in Magdala.
Wonderful.